This tuber contains 4 times the iron of a potato and more prebiotic fiber than nearly any vegetable in common cultivation. It is a perennial. Plant it once, and it returns every year for decades, sometimes centuries. Without replanting, without fertilizer, without care. Native peoples across eastern North America cultivated it as a staple food for at least 1,000 years before European contact. French colonists brought it back to Europe in the early 17th century, where it spread rapidly through gardens and fields. Then, in the 20th century, it became a symbol of poverty, of war, of desperation. It was fed to livestock and the starving. And when the wars ended, it was abandoned. Not because it failed, but because no one wanted to remember what it had meant to need it. This is not a root vegetable in the way carrots or beets are root vegetables. It is a tuber, like a potato, but it grows on a plant that belongs to the sunflower family. The plant towers above the garden, 8 feet, sometimes 10, with rough stems and bright yellow flowers that appear in late summer. Below ground, spreading out from the roots, are the tubers. Knobby, irregular, thin-skinned. They look like ginger roots, pale tan or reddish, covered in small bumps and protrusions. They do not look like food most people recognize, but they are food, and they have been food for a very long time. The archaeological record for this plant is not as deep as for some crops, but ethnobotanical evidence and early colonial accounts make it clear. This tuber was cultivated across the eastern woodlands of North America, long before Europeans arrived. The Haudenosaunee grew it. The Lenape grew it. Communities along the Great Lakes, along the St. Lawrence River, across the Mississippi watershed. This plant was part of the agricultural system. It was not the most important crop. Corn, beans, and squash held that role. But this tuber had qualities that made it valuable. It grew in places where other crops struggled. It tolerated shade. It did not need rich soil. And once established, it did not need to be replanted. The tubers left in the ground over winter sprouted again in spring. The plant returned year after year without human intervention. In 1605, Samuel de Champlain encountered this plant on Cape Cod. He wrote that it tasted like an artichoke. The comparison was imprecise. The flavor is not the same. But the name stuck in French. By 1610, the tuber had been brought to Europe. It spread quickly through France, where it was embraced by gardeners and farmers. It was easy to grow. It required no maintenance. It thrived in marginal soils. For a population familiar with food scarcity, a crop that did not need replanting was valuable. The plant spread to England, to the Netherlands, to Germany. It was listed in seed catalogs. It appeared in garden manuals. Recipes were developed. The tubers were boiled, roasted, mashed, fried. The flavor was mild, slightly sweet, nutty. The texture was crisp when raw, soft when cooked, somewhere between a potato and a water chestnut. But the name became confused. In English, it was called Jerusalem artichoke, though it had no connection to Jerusalem and was not an artichoke. The name likely derived from the Italian word girasole, meaning sunflower, corrupted through mispronunciation into Jerusalem. The confusion persisted. It persists still. For 2 centuries, this plant was grown across Europe and North America. It was not a staple in the way wheat or potatoes were staples, but it was part of the rotation, part of the garden, part of the food supply. Then came the 20th century. During World War I, food shortages across Europe forced populations to rely on whatever crops could be grown quickly and with minimal inputs. This tuber was one of them. It grew without fertilizer, which was in short supply. It grew without care, which was in short supply. It was harvested and eaten, not because it was preferred, but because it was available. During World War II, the pattern repeated, more intensely. In occupied France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, this tuber became a symbol of deprivation. It was what people ate when there was nothing else. It was fed to pigs. It was fed to prisoners. It was fed to anyone who could not afford better. And it caused problems. The tubers contain high levels of inulin, a type of carbohydrate that humans cannot digest. Inulin passes through the stomach and small intestine intact and is fermented by bacteria in the colon. This fermentation produces gas. For populations eating large quantities of these tubers out of necessity, the digestive consequences were significant and humiliating. When the war ended, the plant was abandoned. People who had been forced to eat it during occupation wanted nothing to do with it. It was not just a food. It was a memory of hunger, of occupation, of powerlessness. Gardens were replanted with other crops. Fields were cleared. The tubers were left to rot or were dug up and discarded. In North America, a similar rejection occurred, though for different reasons. By the mid-20th century, American agriculture had committed fully to mechanization and standardization. Crops needed to be uniform in size and shape to be harvested by machine, processed efficiently, and packaged for transport. Potatoes could be mechanically harvested, graded by size, and stored for months. This tuber could not. The tubers are irregular. No two are the same size or shape. They are fragile. The thin skin tears easily, and once damaged, they spoil quickly. They do not store well. Within weeks, they begin to shrivel and rot, unless kept in very specific conditions. Mechanical harvesters designed for potatoes destroyed them. They had to be dug by hand, carefully, one plant at a time. This made them economically unviable in an industrial system. Potatoes could be grown on 1,000-acre fields, harvested in days, and shipped across the country. This tuber could not. It was dropped from commercial agriculture, not because it failed nutritionally or agriculturally, but because it did not fit the infrastructure. At the same time, potatoes were being actively promoted. The potato industry invested in marketing, in research, in distribution networks. Potatoes became the default tuber in the American diet. This plant, which had been cultivated for centuries, became a curiosity, a relic, something remembered only by older gardeners or people with roots in communities that had never stopped growing it. But the plant did not disappear. It could not disappear. Because once this tuber is planted, it is almost impossible to eradicate. The plant is a perennial. The tubers left in the ground over winter sprout again in spring. Even a small fragment of tuber, a piece the size of a fingernail, can generate a new plant. If you harvest the tubers and miss even one, the plant returns. If you dig up the entire patch and a single tuber remains 2 feet away, the plant returns. It spreads through underground rhizomes, sending up new shoots at a distance from the parent plant. In a single season, one plant can become a dozen. In a few years, a small patch can become a thicket. This persistence, which made the plant valuable in subsistence agriculture, made it undesirable in gardens designed for control and order. It became classified as invasive, aggressive, something to be kept out. Gardening guides warned against planting it. If you did plant it, they said, contain it, or you will never be rid of it. This warning was not wrong, but it mistook resilience for malice. In the 1980s and 1990s, nutritional researchers began analyzing forgotten and underutilized crops, looking for alternatives to the narrowing selection of foods in the global diet. This tuber appeared in those studies. The findings were notable. The tubers contain about 73 calories per 100 grams, slightly less than potatoes, but they contain significantly more iron, 3.4 milligrams per 100 grams, compared to 0.8 milligrams in potatoes. They are rich in potassium, thiamine, and other B vitamins, and they contain between 10 and 20% inulin by fresh weight, one of the highest concentrations of any commonly available vegetable. Inulin is a prebiotic fiber. It feeds beneficial bacteria in the gut. In the 1990s, as research into the human microbiome expanded, inulin became recognized as valuable. It is now extracted from this tuber and from chicory root and added to processed foods as a fiber supplement. But for most of the 20th century, Inulin was simply the compound that caused gas when people ate these tubers in large quantities during the war. The benefit was not understood. Only the discomfort was remembered. The tubers also have a low glycemic index, Unlike potatoes, which cause rapid spikes in blood sugar, these tubers release energy slowly. This makes them suitable for diabetic diets, a quality that has been studied in recent decades but was not recognized or valued earlier. From an agricultural perspective, the plant is almost absurdly easy to grow. It tolerates poor soil. It tolerates drought once established. It requires no fertilizer, no pesticides, no fungicides. Pests largely ignore it. Diseases rarely affect it. It grows in full sun or partial shade. It can be planted in spring or fall. The tubers are simply buried a few inches deep, and the plant takes care of the rest. Harvest occurs in late fall, after the first frost kills the above-ground growth. The tubers are dug up, carefully, by hand or with a garden fork. They can be left in the ground through winter and harvested as needed, as long as the ground does not freeze solid. This in-ground storage was one of the plant's great advantages in pre-industrial agriculture. No root cellar was required. The tubers stayed fresh in the soil until they were needed. A single planting can produce food for decades. There are accounts of patches planted in the 1950s still producing in the 2010s, untended, in forgotten corners of properties that had changed hands multiple times. The plant does not quit. It does not need humans. It simply grows. This is a quality that makes it invaluable in permaculture and low-input gardening, but it is also the quality that made it incompatible with industrial agriculture. A crop that does not need to be replanted every year cannot be sold every year. A crop that does not need fertilizer does not support the fertilizer industry. A crop that spreads on its own does not require seed companies. The plant's self-sufficiency was, economically, a flaw. So even as its nutritional value was documented, even as interest in perennial crops and sustainable agriculture grew in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, this tuber remained marginal. It appeared in farmers' markets occasionally, usually sold by small farms or gardeners with surplus. It was listed in specialty seed catalogs. It was discussed in foraging guides and permaculture manuals. But it did not return to mainstream food culture. The memory of the war, of deprivation, of digestive distress lingered. In France, older generations still refused to eat it. In Germany, it remained associated with hardship. The plant had been culturally contaminated by the context in which it had been consumed, and no amount of nutritional data could erase that. But memory fades. Generations pass, and the plant itself remains unchanged, waiting in the soil. In the last decade, a quiet resurgence has begun. Chefs in Europe and North America have started using the tubers again. Roasted, pureed, shaved raw into salads. The flavor, when prepared well, is delicate, slightly sweet, complex. The texture, when roasted, is creamy. The tubers are being recognized not as food of last resort, but as food worth seeking. Home gardeners, particularly those interested in perennial food systems, have begun planting it deliberately. Permaculture advocates promote it as one of the few perennial staple crops that can be grown in temperate climates. Seed, or rather tuber, exchanges distribute it. The plant is returning, not to industrial fields, but to the edges, to small plots, to the places where people grow food for themselves. The plant has a name. It is called the sunchoke, though it is also still known by the older confused name, Jerusalem artichoke. It is easy to recognize once you see it. In summer, it is the tall plant with rough, hairy stems and leaves that look like smaller versions of sunflower leaves. In late summer and fall, it produces bright yellow flowers, small compared to sunflowers but unmistakably similar. In late fall, after frost, the stalks turn brown and dry, and the plant seems to die. But below ground, the tubers remain, alive, waiting. If you grow it, plant the tubers in early spring, 3 to 4 inches deep, a foot or more apart. Choose the location carefully. The plant will spread. Some gardeners plant it in containers sunk into the ground to limit its expansion. Others plant it at the edge of the property, where spreading is not a problem. Once planted, the plant needs almost nothing. Water helps in the first few weeks, but after that, it survives on rainfall. No fertilizer is needed. No care is required. Harvest begins in late fall. Dig carefully around the base of the plant. The tubers radiate outward, sometimes a foot or more from the stem. They break easily, so use hands or a fork, not a shovel. Take what you need, leave the rest. They will sprout again in spring. The tubers can be scrubbed and eaten raw, sliced thin, crisp and slightly sweet. They can be roasted, boiled, steamed, fried. The flavor is mild, nutty, faintly reminiscent of artichoke hearts, which is perhaps why the original comparison stuck. The Inulin content means that eating large quantities at once can cause digestive discomfort, particularly for people unaccustomed to it. Start small. The body adapts. Sunchokes are not rare. They are not difficult to find. Tubers are sold in some grocery stores, often in the specialty or organic section. They are sold at farmers markets. They are available from seed companies and garden suppliers, usually in early spring. Or they can be found growing wild, in abandoned gardens, along roadsides, in places where they were planted once and never removed. The plant did not fail. It was not replaced by something better. It was rejected because it did not fit the system we built. A system that required uniformity, control, replanting, inputs. The sunchoke required none of those things. It simply grew, and for that, it was set aside. But it is still here, in the ground, in the gardens of people who never stopped planting it, in the wild edges where it escaped and thrived, waiting, as it has always waited, to be recognized again. The knowledge was always here. We just stopped looking.